So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is the Mr. Media Interview, sponsored by the audiobook edition of Will Eisner, A Spirited Life, now available on iTunes and Audible.com, and recorded live on blogtalkradio.com from the new media and American League Baseball capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. In my life, it seems all roads lead back to Will Eisner. In 2002, I met the American master artist and writer for the first time over lunch and embarked on a 3-year project to research and write his biography, Will Eisner, A Spirited Life. The project outlasted Will himself, publishing 9 months after he died. Along the way, I met and interviewed a bunch of wonderful people who continue to be part of my life today. One of them is Paul Fitzgerald, the first managing editor of PS Magazine, which was founded by Eisner, and a friend of Eisner's for the rest of his life. Fitz worked with Eisner longer than probably anyone else. They traveled overseas together and shared many social moments in each other's company. A longtime dream of Fitz's was a book that shared with the world one of the lesser-known periods of Eisner's life, his 20 years at the art helm of PS Magazine, the Army's preventive maintenance magazine. The book, Will Eisner and PS Magazine, hit many fits and starts over the last few years before finally publishing this month. Now, you can only order the book directly from Paul Fitzgerald at his website, www.willeisnerandpsmagazine.com. It's an absolute must for any Will Eisner collector and fan. It's beautifully published, well edited. It's just a really nice thing to have. And Paul, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thank you, Bob.
I think I should say welcome back to Mr. Media. We actually did sometime last year, I think we did a roundtable on Will and PS when there was an exhibit at, I think, one of the colleges. But welcome back then.
It's a little more smooth this time.
Yeah, there's always the danger of things getting screwed up with the technical side here. So, Paul, I think it's safe for you to finally take a deep breath. I mean, how does it feel to get this book in print and hold it in your hands after so many years?
I've done it. It's there. I'm really where I want to be.
Yeah. What kept you pressing on, even when it looked like this was never going to happen a year ago?
Well, it has never been a project that was about me. It's a project about Will. Mm-hmm. And it was a project that began to take shape in my mind at his insistence, and pushing it and continuing and insisting on seeing it through to the end is a direct result of a promise that I made to him.
So he wanted this done.
Well, I touch on this in the prologue to the book, but we sat down in a community center basement in D.C. in 2004, and he's been telling me over a number of years that I was the only one, in his opinion, who could really tell the story that needed to be told. And that night I told him that he had finally convinced me.
How do you explain, I mean, your long friend, you worked side by side, well, sort of side by side, but you worked together on PS for about 9 years, but you remained friends and in contact all these many years after. What is it about the two of you, or each of you, that contributed to this long friendship?
I think the real bond was that we both started out as printer's devils or apprentices. And when I first met Will, there was something of a belligerent defensiveness about him. And I was a new kid on the block, and there had been a lot of strife and tension around PS. But after the first dummy conference that I went through with him, he turned to Jim Gibbs and pointed at me and said, "Any guy that can use Simus and pica in the same sentence and understand both, I ought to be able to get along with."
And why is it? I mean, P.S. Maybe we should start here. Why don't you tell folks what P.S. Magazine was and is still today?
Well, P.S. was a revival of a very successful communications program that was initiated by the Department of the Army during World War II, and which Eisner joined shortly after he was drafted into Army service. That was Army Motors, and it was a utilization of comic art and nice-looking ladies and explicit copy to convey motivational and technical information, and aimed at keeping Army equipment usable, functional, and preventing maintenance failures that resulted in operational failures. P.S. went further than Army Motors. It was 5x7. It had 4-color printing on the covers and on the 8-page center signature continuities, and it was just acclaimed at every turn. It arose in the early stages of the Korean War because of problems that they were having with maintenance of somewhat obsolete or revived technical equipment.
Why did the Army need an artist of Will Eisner's stature and experience for a magazine? I mean, isn't this generally, highly technical stuff? What's the guy who at the time had just finished 10, 12 years producing The Spirit working for the Army?
There was a long-time colonel named Leo Codd in the office of the Chief of Ordnance, and I think he is pretty well identified as the individual who reached out and put a finger on Eisner at Aberdeen Proving Ground and plucked him out of basic training and introduced him to the world of Army Motors. And when the subject of a similar need arose in the beginning stages of the Korean War, Codd naturally thought of Eisner, and when from the concept, the very initial moves to establish the magazine, Eisner as an integral part was just part of the earliest discussions.
But I mean, maybe I should ask this in a different way. Why is there a comic book artist? Because that's basically what he was known as then. Why was a comic book artist involved with a military magazine, and why would the Army want to produce comics?
The basic reason is that it had been fairly well established in the Army Motor days that the comics were the greatest competition for the soldiers' attention in the way of time and reading material. They were just going to where the soldier lived.
Were there people within the Army who kind of looked down on this idea?
But of course, it was beneath the dignity of the Army of the United States. That was a fight that I shouldn't say fight, but an ongoing debate and discourse that existed from the beginning and continued well up into P.S.'s long life, probably diminished and was put to rest when we arrived at the point where we had an all-volunteer Army.
What was kind of the commonality that would allow soldiers to read it? I mean, I know I talked in The Spirited Life about this, and I suggested that at the time of Army Motors, and even later, a decade later, there were guys who were coming from all kinds of levels of experience. Some who could read, some who couldn't, some who had indoor plumbing, some who didn't, and the comics seemed to be the way that they could all connect to the information.
I think you could identify three significant salient factors that are key to understanding PS's success. One of them is a red flag, but to name the three, it's laughter, sex, and simplicity. And PS has embodied, to one degree or another, all three of those from the very beginning. Everybody needs a laugh to carry them along. Laughter is especially essential in getting through adverse circumstances. The simplicity has become a hallmark of PS for its particular form of text and direct, plain language explication of sometimes quite complex problems. Sex, whether overt or subtle or excessive or moderate, has been a pendulum that has swung back and forth over the years with PS. Now it's pretty much under control and restrained, but there's still a presence of the female personality in the magazine.
How controversial was the sex in 1953 and 54, or was it not controversial at all? I know it became that way later.
The sex really became a problem in the era of Bella Abzug and William Broxmire, the congresswoman and the senator, which was about 2.5, 3 decades later. In the beginning, the real controversy was about the appearance of the characters, the male characters, the soldiers in the magazine, and that was the fact that we had some dedicated characters who were, one was called Joe Dope, and he was one. Joe did wrong things, the right things he tried to do, he did the wrong way. He did more damage than he did good, and he had a sidekick named Fosnoff who was even worse than he was, and Joe was trying to teach Foz how to do things right, and that set up the dialogue to pitch the commercial message that had to come along. But talk about the dignity of the soldier's image. There are a lot of people who thought that every soldier that appeared in PS should be the very essence of spit and polish and shine. And that debate carried to high quarters, and it never went away. And there were very ardent and quite articulate spokespeople on both sides of the discussion. But spit and polish sort of won in the end, even though we had a rehabilitation program for Joe and Foz. Foz was discharged first, and Joe slipped away a year or two later. And since then, we've had ideal role models, so to speak.
What's the question that when people find out that you worked with Will on PS, which not many people know that much about, what do they want to know from you about him?
Most of them are just amazed at his versatility, and they were particularly intrigued with his techniques. They wondered what kind of a guy he is, what his sense of humor was, and but especially did we have any artistic conflicts over what would end up in print and what wouldn't. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the area that really bonded Will and me, because I could be right firm as having the final rejection, but I also was aware of what he was trying to accomplish, and I was aware of the limitations of the physical processes within which he had to function. He had some previous supervisory contacts at PS that would want to pick and change commas up until the last step out the door with the art that was going to the printer. And when you've got somebody like Will who is paying top dollar prices in hot metal type to be making author's alterations at the last minute, you're talking about dollar bills flying out the window too.
Right.
I think. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, please finish your thought.
I think one of the amazing things about PS is that in its 58 years, it's gone through, I'd say, 3 tremendously progressive technical revolutions in the graphic arts industry, from first from cold type, hot type to cold type, mm-hmm. and then from paste up to on-screen pagination, and now you can conceivably never end up without a piece of paper. The whole transaction takes place between one computer at PS and the art contractors, and then from there to the computer at the printer. Mm-hmm. And in the early stages, it was a complex, very expensive and time-consuming process. And we had to discipline ourselves to realize what Eisner was dealing with, and the fact that it did us no good to drive him into bankruptcy with fantasy and foolishness.
I wanted to ask you about one of the more colorful characters in PS's history, and that is Norman Colton, who is the guy who was there at the beginning with Will and someone he knew from the Army. And now I wrote about a bit about Colton, but there wasn't much known, and there wasn't. Will could only tell me so much at the time that I spent time with him. But in the last couple of years, you made a bit of a discovery about Colton, didn't you?
Yes, indeed. Colton started out with Army Motors when it was a mimeograph sheet. Long before Eisner had ever heard of it. And he stuck with it all the way through until they both were discharged from the Army. He and Will made, I think, a one-edition shot to produce a civilian Army Motors, but that one edition is the only one that I've been able to lay hands on. When they started to talk about founding PS, it was as natural for them to reach out to Colton as it was to reach out to Will, and it was sort of a package deal. Plus the fact that Colton, as a civilian, had civil service status, and that wasn't a hiring process that would be involved. I think he just got into a transfer. But Colton was a diminutive individual. He never walked, he strutted. He was a dapper Dan, immaculate dresser. And some folks thought the short man's overcompensation, but he was quite aggressive, and that aggressiveness took him along avenues that led to his eventual invited departure from PS. It was stated to be travel reimbursement irregularities, but I think you discovered that he had tried to shake down Will rather harshly at one stage along the way.
Right.
So after Colton left PS, he ended up in all kinds of bunco operations, as the old cops say, perpetual motion and time machines and space travel. And Otis T. Carr was was one of his clients. And Otis T. Carr was famous for claiming to have invented space machines. They scheduled appearances and demonstrations around the country, but it's amazing the variety and scope of the difficulties that always arose at the last minute. I finally, Colton ended up in Baltimore working with an advertising agency there, and he died after a pretty long bout with dementia in the York, Pennsylvania area. I talked to his son, and the son has a fond, almost whimsical recollection and feeling for his father, and he and I both laughed together about some of the things that had happened.
Well, we would hope that the son would feel that way, right?
But of course.
That's always the really sad stories, when the son does not feel that way. Now, you traveled frequently with Will. I wondered if you'd mind sharing a story from a particular trip. I'm thinking of Korea.
Well, among other things, I have in my possession a Will Eisner original unsigned cartoon depicting me, as the Irish would phrase it, having drink taken. It's black and white, and it does me justice, I think. As I said, it's not signed, and it just came out of Will's shop, but I have shown copies to both Mike Plug and Murphy Anderson, and they say it and another one of me in Alaska could only be from Will's hands.
Yeah.
Did you have any particular one of the Korean episodes in mind that...
Well, yeah. I mean, I was kind of thinking of when you went to... I'm trying to think of the tea house.
Oh, yes. That was on Okinawa at the tea house of
the August Moon.
Yeah. And this was an after-hours party that our military escort had arranged for us, and it devolved to performances by the geishas, instrumental and vocal, and at one point the mistress of ceremonies announced that the next song was going to be a Japanese folk song called the Coal Miner Song. And the lady sang it with gestures and swinging a pick and pushing a shovel and all that sort of thing. And when it was over, Will mentioned to the person in charge of the establishment that I, pointing at me, had been a coal miner too. And the conversation went on, and I felt free to mention that we too had a folk song about the coal miner's daughter. And nothing would do but I sing it. So I did, and the first couple of bars, it began to be obvious that there was a communication problem, and Will jumped to fill the void and grabbed his sketch pad and his pen and told me to start over and that he would do a storyboard as I sang it. And there was much oohs and ahs and intaking of sudden breath, and then of course, so.
Yeah,
and I wish I had that storyboard.
Oh, I bet. I bet. And I have to ask you to share with folks who probably have not heard it. Eisner and his studio produced 20 years worth of art for PS. And here's the setup. What happened to that art, Paul?
Well, let me say first, Bob, that I am very pleased that in the process of developing this book, I have accumulated a library of nearly 3,000 raw images of Will Eisner PS art. And I think, and that's printing quality, not screen quality or monitor quality, if I may make that difference. But the PS has moved a lot over the years. It's gone from Aberdeen Proving Ground to Raritan Arsenal in New Jersey to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and then to Lexington Bluegrass, Kentucky Army Depot, and now it's been at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama since 1993. When they got ready to make the move from Lexington to Huntsville, they decided that they could no longer continue to keep moving all this art around, so they were directed to package all this original art. And this, you have to remember, included all of the Eisner years, and that done by Chuck Kramer and Plug and Murphy Anderson. I think even Zeke Zeekles was in there. And they were directed to package it up and ship it to Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania for preservation as part of the Army's archives. 3 or 4 years later, Will was helping Cat Ironwood in a project that involved him, and they wanted to borrow some of the PS art for that purpose. And when the inquiry was made to, or the process was started to withdraw temporarily the requested pieces of art from Carlisle, it was discovered or revealed that there was nothing there, that it had all been deliberately burned in a large furnace that they use for surplus documents. And what a heartbreaker that was.
Yeah, that's just, I think that Will would never acknowledge it as such, but I think that had to be, top 10 saddest moments of his life was finding out that all that work had just vanished like that. And our mutual friend Stuart Henderson, who is at PS, I believe to this day, has sworn that if he finds it was not destroyed and somebody's out there and got it, that person will be making large rocks into small rocks for the rest of their life. Yeah, that was kind of tough. Well, let me ask you this: outside of your book, and let me give out the website again if someone wants to order the book, because there's only one place you can get this book, and that is at Paul's website. It's Will Eisner and PSMagazine.com. You can order it there and nowhere else. And if you're nice about it, I suspect Paul will autograph your copy for you. But where else can people see this art that's in PS? Is it online somewhere?
Yes, there's a quite extensive and complete collection on the website of Virginia Commonwealth University.
Very good. So we want to encourage people to check that out.
There also is an official PS magazine website available now, and there's a link to that on the my website that you just cited.
Okay. So we want to encourage people to go there. Again, Will Eisner and PSMagazine.com. So as we kind of wind down, Paul, for what do you most want people to remember Will Eisner?
I think he was an amazingly versatile artist, and but you know, the surprising thing is that he always wanted to be called a writer. He said he always used the word lagniappe, a Cajun word for a little something extra. He said the art is just lagniappe. He says, I'm basically a storyteller. And a lot of people have found a difficulty in reconciling the Eisner of the Spirit comic strip and PS Magazine with the Eisner of Fagin and the Plot. And I think they are making a mistake in trying to reconcile the two because they're the same person who is just amazingly versatile. The stuff he did with the Spirit and PS, he did that with a twinkle and a grin. And when it came around to Fagin and the Plot, I think he did those with clenched teeth and a steely stare. What do you think about that, Bob?
I think you're probably right. I think there is, I think that's. I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think that's a pretty apt description of a man that we've both known, you for much longer than I. And I want to ask you this, and folks, I want to describe. I should have done this earlier, but I want to tell you a little something about Paul Fitzgerald before we go here. Besides being the first managing editor of PS from 1953 to 1963, he was in the Army. He was commissioned as an Army second lieutenant, and later he was recruited when he was 60 to join the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and spent the next 8 years ultimately retiring as chief of its communication services. So, and he still writes. You can see his stuff on occasion in the Army Times and the Washington Post, and locally, if you're up in Virginia, he writes a column for the Fincastle Herald. Paul, so as I say all this, I'm wondering, I asked you about what you'd like people to most remember Will for. What do you want, what about yourself? What do you want to be remembered for? What would you like your legacy to be?
A good reporter. You think that's sufficient?
I think that covers some pretty good ground. Yeah, that's pretty good. All right. Well, folks, there is only one place where you can find Paul Fitzgerald's new book, Will Eisner and PS Magazine, and that's online at his website, www.willeisnerandpsmagazine.com. And there's a link. There'll be a link to it on MrMedia.com. You can, if you somehow cannot correctly spell Will Eisner and PSMagazine.com, you'll be able to find the link on the website. It's a beautiful book. My friend Paul put an awful lot of himself into it. There are, in addition to a ton of four-color art from PS, there are his interviews with a lot of people who worked on PS over the years. Some names you'll know, some you won't. He's reproduced his correspondence with Will over the years, which took me back to see that Will Eisner Studios logo in Tamarack, Florida, and you get a sense of a real human being when you read this stuff. And Paul, congratulations on the book. I know how hard you worked on it. I know firsthand how hard you worked on it. And thanks for joining us on Mr. Media today and talking about it.
Thank you for having me, Bob.
All right, and best of luck to you, and let's talk very soon, off the air. And folks, for more interviews with your favorite comics artists and writers, you can surf over to our main website, www.mrmedia.com. That's where you can listen to my earlier conversations with Dave Gibbons, Monty Wolverton, Trina Robbins, Dennis Kitchen, Gene Colon, Mike Gold, Wendy Peeney, Joe Sinnott, Chuck Dixon, Peter Cooper, Drew Friedman, Gary Groth, Kim Thompson, John Rosenberg, Daniel Pink, and many more. And please think about writing an online review of Mr. Media, casting a vote for Mr. Media, or marking Mr. Media as one of your favorites. That's whether you listen on Blog Talk Radio, TrueSlant, Pointer Online, MySpace, Facebook, NetVibes, Multiply, Zanga, Friendster, Orkut, Bebo, Podcast Pickle, Vox, Folio, Mediafly, PageFlakes, Podfeed.net, Blueberry, Eons, Mihente, Zencast, Zimbio, or Odeo. And subscribe to Mr. Media in iTunes, and you'll never miss a show. Just search Mr. Media Interviews within the podcast section of iTunes and click the free subscribe button. It's that easy. You can also listen with a piece of string and a tin can in many locations. If you've got an idea for a guest, email me directly at bob@andelman.com. That's ANDELMAN. You can also follow me on Facebook or on Twitter, www.twitter.com/Andelman. Thanks so much for joining us today. I always appreciate when you give up a piece of your day to spend it with us. Thanks for listening, everybody.